Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, ever merciful. Assalamu alaikum. Peace and blessings of Allah be upon you, dear viewers. Welcome to tonight's live online lecture organized by the UK Talim Department. As per our tradition, we will start with the recitation of the Holy Quran. If I could please request Faizan Rajput Sahib to recite a portion.
Jazakallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أمن هو قانت آناء الليل ساجدا وقائما يحذر الآخرة ويرجو رحمة ربه قل هل يستوي الذين يعلمون والذين لا يعلمون إنما يذكر أولو الألباب قل يا عبادي الذين آمنوا اتقوا ربكم للذين أحسنوا في هذه الدنيا حسنة وأرض الله واسعة إنما يوفى الصابرون أجرهم بغير حساب. Urdu translation of the verses which have just been recited. अल्लाह के नाम के साथ जो बेइंतहा रहम करने वाला, बिन मांगे देने वाला और बार बार रहम करने वाला है। जिन आयत की अभी तिलावत की गई है ये सूरह ज़ुमर की आयत 10 और 11 हैं। क्या वो जो रात की घड़ियों में इबादत करने वाला है, कभी सजदा की हालत में और कभी क़याम की सूरत में आखिरत से डरता है और अपने रब की रहमत की उम्मीद रखता है, साहिबे इल्म नहीं होता? तो पूछ कि क्या वो लोग जो इल्म रखते हैं और वो जो इल्म नहीं रखते बराबर हो सकते हैं? यकीनन अक्ल वाले ही नसीहत पकड़ते हैं। तू कह दे कि ऐ मेरे बंदो जो ईमान लाए हो, अपने रब का तकवा इख्तियार करो। उन लोगों के लिए जो एहसान से काम लेते हैं इस दुनिया में भी भलाई होगी और अल्लाह की ज़मीन वसी है। यकीनन सब्र करने वालों ही को बगैर हिसाब के उनका भरपूर अजर दिया जाता है।
Jazakallah, Faizan Sahib. Now, it isn't every day that we get the opportunity of having with us the son of a world-renowned scientific genius. Tonight is an exception. We have the enormous singular privilege of being joined by Ahmad Salam Sahib, son of the great Professor Abdus Salam Sahib, who in 1979 was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics, thus becoming the first Muslim to receive such an accolade in the sciences. Professor Salam Sahib enjoyed an illustrious career and made such an impact in his field that he has had honors bestowed on him even after his passing. Only 2 weeks ago, English Heritage honored Professor Salam Sahib by unveiling a blue plaque at his residence in South London, United Kingdom. We will just see a short report from MTA News about this historic event.
Sheldon L. Glasgow and Stephen Weinberg of the United States and Abdus Salam of Pakistan for their contributions to the theory of unified weak and electromagnetic interaction between elementary particles.
1979, the year the first Muslim was awarded the Nobel Prize for the Sciences. Dr. Abdus Salam was a Nobel laureate in the field of physics. Professor Abdus Salam fought hard to bring science and technology to his home nation of Pakistan, serving as the first scientific advisor to the president. He was the founder and the first director of the Space and Upper Atmosphere Research Commission, head of Pakistan's delegation at the International Atomic Energy Agency, and was instrumental in the establishment of the Pakistan Institute of Nuclear Science and Technology, regarded as the most advanced and premium research facility in Pakistan. As well as founding partnership associations with CERN and NASA, Professor Salam went on to establish his own institution, the International Center for Theoretical Physics, and served in many United Nations committees, furthering the profile of theoretical physics on an international scale. Professor Salam has been awarded a large number of accolades in recognition of his contributions to science, the latest of which was presented on the 27th of November 2020, when English Heritage unveiled a blue plaque at the home of Professor Salam in Putney. Over 960 blue plaques have honoured great men and women across London since 1886, the latest residing at this historical landmark.
Today has been a really special day because we've put up a plaque for Abdus Salam in his home. Salam is, for us, exciting because he was the first Muslim Nobel laureate, and he is actually one of our first Indian Muslim scientists. The Blue Plaque scheme has been going for over 150 years, just in London. And we have now, with Salam, 964 plaques across London.
This is my father's room, and this is very much the room where he lived and where he worked. And you'll see books and books and books, papers, files, etc. And then we have his one of his most treasured possessions, his music center, as it was called back in the 70s. But actually it was the record player that he wanted more than anything else, because he would always listen to the records of the Holy Quran. English Heritage, they put Nobel laureate, and then they put champion of science in developing countries. And that really has been his greatest legacy, is the fact that he's left so much for so many young, bright students from the developing countries.
Due to current pandemic restrictions, a formal ceremony was replaced with public messages from several members of Parliament commemorating the plaque and the life of this great ambassador for science.
I'm delighted English Heritage has decided to put up a blue plaque to Professor Abdus Salam.
He was a man inspired by his faith of Islam. He was also a champion for the developing world's role in science.
He was a renowned physicist, professor of physics, and winner of the Nobel Prize, and a member of the local Ahmadiyya community.
Well, Professor Salam had the practice of everything. He brought together Islam, science, and international cooperation.
A Nobel Prize winner and a dedicated man of faith, it is only right that Professor Salam is remembered in this way.
It gives me great pleasure, and I'm truly delighted at the news that Professor Salam has been honoured with a blue plaque.
Imperial's Provost, Professor Ian Walmsley, who was taught by Professor Salam in the 1970s, said, Abdus Salam's contributions to physics were profound, and his commitment to science deep, as exemplified by his founding the International Center for Theoretical Physics in Trieste, which has the aim of building science capability and capacity in the developing world. Professor Salam was based in his Putney home from 1957, and from here would go on to found the Department for Theoretical Physics at Imperial College, establish his International Institute, and achieve Nobel laureateship from this historic landmark. This report is brought to you from MTA International, UK Studios in London. What you also saw and heard from Ahmad Salam Sahib, who is the son of Professor Abdus Salam Sahib. Ahmad Sahib is himself a career investment banker with over 35 years experience. More recently, he moved into private equity. He has sat on a number of boards of companies in the UK and advised these companies. He is currently serving as National Secretary for Sanat-o-Tijarat, that is trade and industry, in the Ahmadiyya Muslim Association UK. We are very grateful indeed that he has spared his very valuable time to be with us this evening to speak on tonight's topic titled Professor Abdus Salam, Reflections on the Life and Times of a Servant of Peace. As always, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. These will be put to Ahmad Sahib on your behalf in the last 15 minutes. Please type your questions into the live chat and kindly ensure that they are relevant to tonight's topic. It gives me great pleasure indeed to hand over to Ahmad Salam Sahib to deliver tonight's lecture.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. It is a great honor and a pleasure to be asked to say a few words about my father, and I'm always delighted to be invited to do so. And firstly, as Waqar Sahib just said, we want this to be an interactive program, and your questions are very welcome. I can give you background stories about my father's life, but there's always questions that come through. And the more questions that you put onto the screen, the more information I can give you, which I hope you'll find interesting and relevant. Before I go into the topic of my speech, just a little slight side comment. You'll see in that clip that NTA just showed of the Nobel ceremony, and of course I was very privileged to be there. I was 19 at the time, and so I do remember quite a bit about that trip to Stockholm. When we got to Stockholm, none of us knew how to tie a turban, and it was a real panic situation in the hotel because nobody knew how to tie the turban that my father was going to wear. And my father was getting more and more agitated and more concerned that he would not have the turban and the pugri that he was so keen to wear. And finally, we managed to find the cook of the Pakistan ambassador in Sweden. He said he could tie a turban, but as you see from the pictures, it was not very well tied, but it managed to do the job on the day, and that's the most important thing. In terms of my actual speech today and what I wanted to talk about, I've spoken a number of times about my father, his life, his influences, his relationship with his father, and I'll touch on some of those subjects again later today. And one of the questions that does often come up is the question of the greatest influences on my father's life. And I'll talk about some of those as well. I have to say, at the outset, I'm saddened to sometimes read some of the articles, books, and interviews with people who claim that they knew my father and claim that they have some insight into his life. And some of what they write is undoubtedly true, but some of it is made up and purely fictional or exaggerated to give the author more credibility than the author justifies. So the author can give an impression that he had a very close relationship with my father. So there's often a lot of misinformation out there. And what I'd refer members who are interested in reading more, there's a number of biographies available, which you should have a look at. And I'm sure many of you, of course, will have seen the Netflix documentary. And I think it's important to give everyone a little bit of background to the Netflix documentary and explain some of the parts of the film as well. So the producers of the film were two young Pakistani boys, Zakir Tabar and Umar Vandal, and they grew up in Pakistan, were educated in Pakistan, and then went to America. And it was only when they got to America that they heard about this man called Abdus Salam, and they suddenly were amazed about his achievements, which are completely unrecognized back in Pakistan. There were no books, there were no libraries, there was no reference to Abdus Salam anywhere back in Pakistan. And they were so moved by this that they felt they had to do something about this. So for 14 years, they labored every free moment they had to try and create this documentary about the life of Abdus Salam. So as you'll have seen, the film is very Pakistan-centric. The Zakir and Ahmad spent their time researching, going around the world, collecting as many archive film and footage as they could, and then raising the money. They had to raise the money separately to pay for all this archive material. And that was quite a huge task just in itself, to raise the money. And what's interesting is that we obviously cooperated with the making of the film, but we did not have any influence in the film itself as such. The producers were completely independent on the line that they wanted to take. And there was, as I said, no influence. This was not our film. We did not dictate in any way what script they followed. And it's therefore entirely their work. The reality is the film had to be cut down to 75 minutes in order to be shown on Netflix. Because the primary audience was the Pakistan population, the only people who would be brave enough to show the film in Pakistan and not particularly care about the consequences would be Netflix. No other Pakistani station would ever carry a film like this because it would just be too dangerous for them. So Netflix determined it had to be 75 minutes. And so the film itself could have been much longer. But Zakir and Ahmad said we have to make it 75 minutes. And therefore, the film perhaps doesn't cover the role that my father had outside of Pakistan and the huge influence he had globally, especially within the developing world. But there are certain points that I also just want to clarify. And one is the most important question, which keeps coming up, was your father involved with the nuclear program? And I know the film leaves the question slightly open, and Tariq Ali makes the point that the question is deliberately left open because there isn't anyone around now who can give a definitive answer. And that I don't agree with, because the meeting in 1972, the famous Multan meeting, where Bhutto called together all the scientists, which my father attended, was where nuclear power was talked about in a very serious manner. And for my father in particular, remember he was the chief scientific advisor to the president and obviously to the prime minister of Pakistan. For him, nuclear power was an important consideration in order to bring science and technology and to bring economic growth into Pakistan. And it was important because Pakistan could not keep building power plants to just run on coal and oil and gas, etc., because that was not a particularly economically sound strategy. So nuclear power was the best way of giving Pakistan the power it needed in order to build an industrial base, because about 80% of the Pakistan economy, of course, was agricultural, and they needed to have an industrial base. So that meeting in 1972, my father knew that there was going to be a considerable amount of money made available for scientists and scientific research within Pakistan. And so he attended that meeting on the expectation that he would be able to find the funding that he needed to create a scientific and a technological basis within Pakistan. He never had any desire, in interviews later on, to create a weapon of any sort. That was never his agenda. And I think it's important to make the point, of course, that the meeting happened in 72. And in 74, when the Ahmadiyya Muslim community was made second-class citizens, my father resigned any official capacity from the Pakistan government. So within that 2-year period, he could not have actually even physically have achieved anything to create the nuclear weapon. And of course, in 1998, Pakistan detonated its nuclear device. So just the timeline alone of that 2-year period would indicate that he had no real, no impact at all, actually, in the nuclear weapons program in particular. The other point I wanted to make was perhaps a slightly more personal one, and that is with regards to the illness which began to affect him probably in the late 1980s. And this illness, PSP, supranuclear palsy, was a particularly unpleasant neurological illness which very few people suffer from, and therefore medical science has not spent a lot of time trying to understand its origins, and its cures as well. And a couple of the people, Stephen Weinberg, talked about his visit to see my father in Oxford at the time. And he talked about the fact that Salam was just sitting there, and it was a very depressing last meeting with him. And what the film didn't have time to talk about was that the illness was a neurological illness, where a chemical imbalance in the brain. And what happened was that slowly my father began to lose all his physical capabilities. So he lost his ability to swallow, and he was fed through a tube in the stomach with a liquid. He lost all his muscle usage, and so he couldn't move anything. The only part of his anatomy that he could move was his eyelids. That's the only part. And the only way that he could show emotion was by tears. And so when people went to see him and he would cry, people didn't necessarily understand until we explained to them why he was crying, because that's the only way he could show his appreciation for the fact that people had come to see him. So I thought it was important just to make those 2 points during the film. I think one of the other interesting things that was missed out in the film, again because of time, was the story of UNESCO. And when my father was asked to be potentially nominated, or potentially going to be nominated, as a leading contender to take over the UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, based in Paris in 1984. And I was quite actively involved, to the extent that I went with my father and took my father to a number of the meetings. And UNESCO had been under pressure from its main donor countries, from England, America, France, etc., that it had lost its way and it wasn't achieving what it was set up to do in terms of educational and scientific leadership in the developing world in particular. And it also was the turn of the developing world to present a director general. And my father was a leading contender to be in that role. He actually then went around the world, and he started off by presenting to Mrs. Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the UK, who herself was a scientist. And he went to meet her and spoke to her. And she said, if you become Director General, we will take United Kingdom back into UNESCO, and we will resume our role within UNESCO. He then flew to America and met President Reagan, and President Reagan gave him the same assurance again, that if you, because of what we believe in you and what your agenda is and what you're trying to achieve, if you are able to be elected, or nominated and elected as the Director General, then we will also come back into UNESCO. The same happened in France and every country that he went to. The problem was, being a Pakistani national, he had to be nominated by his home country. Therefore, Pakistan had to nominate him. And what did that mean? That means the government had to effectively put his name forward to UNESCO for him to be elected. I remember going to the Hilton Hotel in London, taking my father to meet then Prime Minister Junaid, and my father and I went in to meet him. And Pakistan already had a potential contender for the role, who was a retired military general. Bizada, I think was his name. And my father said, we as Pakistan can nominate 2 people. If the UNESCO committee wishes to have an administrator, they should have Bizada, because he's a great administrator and has done a great job. If they want to have a scientist, you can nominate Abdus Salam. And the Prime Minister said very clearly to my father, of course, we cannot do this because of your background, and I've spoken to the President, Zia al-Haq, and we cannot formally nominate you. And that, very sadly, was the end of my father's opportunity to become the Director General of UNESCO. And for him, that would have been a crowning glory, because he then could have made significant improvements and achievements for science and education in the developing world. So that point wasn't covered in the film, again, because of lack of time, and I'm not criticizing the producers or the director in any shape or form. The other little fact which was also missed out was that when my father was awarded the Nobel Prize, the first invitation for him to come and visit the country came from his dear friend, Mrs. Indira Gandhi from India. And it was only when India extended the invitation that General Zia was embarrassed so much that he then sent an invitation. And of course, my father, never wanting to embarrass Pakistan because of his love for Pakistan, instantly accepted General Zia's invitation and Mrs. Gandhi's invitation and said, I will visit Pakistan first as my first tour post the Nobel ceremony in December, and then I will come to India. And that again is a reflection of my father's love for Pakistan. And there's one other little story and little anecdote that I'll tell you, that when my father was in one of the official ceremonies in December 79 in Islamabad with General Zia, and my father, along with his brothers, asked General Zia if they could say their prayers, offer their namaz. And General Zia said, yes, we've prepared a room for you where you and your brothers can say your prayers. And my father said to General Zia, would you like to come and join us? And General Zia said, I don't think I'll be able to do that, but I do recognize you're a better Muslim than I am. And my father said, may I quote you on that? And General Zia said, I will deny it. Which I thought was a very, very interesting little anecdote told by my father directly. The other point that I wanted to make was that I have letters here in my father's room to show that even though people accuse my father of turning his back on Pakistan, he never, ever turned his back on Pakistan. Whilst he was no longer officially and actively involved in the government constantly turned to him for support, guidance, and advice, whether it was the Munir Khan, who is the chairman of the Atomic Energy Agency in Pakistan, always writing and coming to see my father. Or I even have a letter from General Zia where he's forwarded a paper about education and science in Pakistan to my father and asking my father for advice. And this is a personal letter signed by General Zia. So it just shows the hypocrisy of Pakistan, that publicly they would criticize him and could not have anything to do with him, but privately, behind the scenes, they were in constant dialogue with him and constantly reaching out to him to ask him for advice and guidance. Could you just show the Cambridge video for a second, please?
Cambridge is a very old town with many charms, but some of them have to be looked for, quiet, narrow little streets. Here and there, an old house or row of houses, seemingly ignoring the push of time. Lovely groups of little rooftops, huddled away in unsuspected corners. If these were to disappear, Cambridge would lose one of its greatest charms. And the churches, large and small, are of beauty and interest. But for the undergraduate, Cambridge means the university and his college. Two independent but interdependent bodies, which in their different ways contribute to his education. The university teaches and trains him in the libraries, museums, lecture rooms, and laboratories, and then finally gives him his degree in the Senate House. His college offers him a home where he lives, works, and plays. This home he shares with men who are studying not only his own, but other subjects as well. Anyone who has been to Cambridge will remember many things about the university and his college. The early morning walk across the court for a bath, and then, after breakfast, the start for the 9 o'clock lecture. Shortly before the hour, sometimes very shortly, men begin to leave their colleges, down the staircases and into the courts. Singly, or in twos and threes, hurriedly or leisurely, some with and some without gowns. Science men don't wear gowns at work. The great trek starts for the university lecture halls and laboratories. The day's work is beginning. At this hour, every day of the week except Sunday, King's Parade and other streets in Cambridge are full of men and women on foot and bicycle.
the reason I wanted to show that short clip, that was Cambridge in 1946, the year that my father came to Cambridge. And if you imagine, here was somebody who had never left his country, India in those days, as it still was. He'd come on the boat, he had landed in England at Liverpool, he had met Jodi Zafullah Khan Sahib there very briefly, and then he'd come down to Cambridge on the train. And that was the world he came into. Imagine somebody who'd never left his home coming into that very English, traditional, dominated seat of huge intellectual and academic excellence. And here was somebody who had to assimilate into that world, begin to understand the people around him and build relationships with those people. But he had nothing in common with them. All he had was his intellectual capability. And I think that struggle, and that there must have been racism in those days, because people didn't know what Islam was. They didn't know what a Muslim was. They didn't know the beliefs of a Muslim. And as my brother said in the film, he lived on a diet of macaroni effectively for 3 years because there was no halal meat, and there was actually very little meat after the Second World War anyway. And what meat there was all pork. So he had a very limited diet, and a lot of the whole Cambridge lifestyle passed him by because he just didn't understand what it was all about and how he could reconcile his Muslim background with what the background of all the students in Cambridge was. And I think that must have had a very significant impact on him. And I've often thought about, because people ask me, what were these influences on your father that led him not only to be a great intellectual, which of course was a God-given gift, but actually living up to his name as being the servant of peace. Of course, the most important influence was the role of my grandfather, my father's father, and the influence and prayers of him on my father. I equally must not miss out on the influence of my father's mother, my grandmother, and the respect and love they had for both his parents, which was so strong. And above all else, his father always gave him the time to help and encourage and work with him. He gave him as much time as he could to focus and work and develop himself in every sense, not just academically, but morally, spiritually, and as a man, just from simple things like good manners and integrity and all the lessons that his father taught him. And it's a lesson that my father also gave to us as well, as his children, that time was never to be wasted. We were to be encouraged to follow education and to gain knowledge, as the Holy Quran tells us to, at every point in our lives. So whether I was driving him to college, or when I was much younger and I was 7 or 8 years old, and I would go with my uncle to pick up my father after he had been at college for the day. On the way home, my father would always talk to me and explain whether it was how car engines worked, or stories of Islamic history, or stories of the companions of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, or stories of the Rajput princes, which is part of our cultural heritage as a family. And that time that he gave us was so important, and it's such a lesson that parents today need to learn, to give their time to their children, not just try and push them away with a phone or an iPad or a toy or something, but actually give them their time above all else. That was the lesson we learned, that the most important thing you can give your child is your time, not a material possession. My parents and his parents, of course, had that example of sacrificing whatever they could for their children, sacrificing time and money and give us the best start that we could have in life, and not material possessions, but just their time, which is far more important than just the material possessions. As I said, I think it's an extremely important point. I've spoken in the past about the great influences Jodi Zafullah Khan had in the past, and I'm not sure I should cover it here, but one of the questions I'm often asked is about the influence of Hazrat Khalifa al-Masih al-Salis and Hazrat Khalifa al-Masih al-Rabi, may Allah be pleased with them both, and how they influenced him massively. And again, one small anecdote that I'll give you, that when my grandfather passed away and the body was taken back to Rabwa, my father was actually in America at the time, and in 1969, when he passed away, he was actually at the White House, and he was able to put a call through to Pakistan solely because he was in the White House, to Pakistan, and to hear the news of his father's demise. And at the janazah, which was led by Hazrat Abdus Salam, he after he buried him, he said to Hazur that, we buried my father, and Hazur said to him, "I will now be your father." And that was the relationship which he had with one of the Khalifas. And then obviously Hazrat Rabi, who I was a witness to, his relationship with Hazur was extremely important. And I've got one eye on the clock. I would love to read you the tribute that Hazur made about my father, writing a few words. So if we have time at the end of the speech, I'll come back and read through that. My father, as many of you who've met him or know of him, he was a very charming and a very humble man, very simple in all his tastes and needs. And I was always amazed at this. He could converse with anyone, be they, and I saw this in the house here, whether we had the president of Libya come to visit us at home and he would have dinner at home with us, or whether he was speaking with a driver or a waiter. He dealt with everybody with exactly the same compassion, exactly the same love, and exactly the same respect. There was no difference in the way he treated people. I've told the story often where if a driver had picked him up from the airport and brought him back home after a long journey, my job was to make sure the driver was given refreshments. And only after I'd given the driver tea and biscuits or something, I would come back in and tell my father that I'd given the driver tea. Then my father would take his own tea. He would wait until the driver had been given his refreshments. And the manners that he taught us was so important. Respect for elders, time for elders, to sit in the company of great people and to learn from great people was so important. When we had my father in London, and going back to this thing of spending time with us, he would insist we all had to have dinner together. So we'd all sit around the table, myself, my sisters, and my mother, and we'd all have dinner together. And my father would go around the table and speak to each of us and find out what we were doing, talk to us, give us advice, give us guidance, tell us off if we weren't doing things properly, if we weren't working hard enough. If the grades weren't good enough, we were told off and told to do better. I remember my sister telling the story that she got 98% in a test and came second. And all my father said to her was, "Who came first?" That was his only reaction. Not a congratulations, but who came first and why didn't you get first position? He had very high standards in academic science. But manners were always very important. We were never allowed to leave the table without asking to be excused. So I'd have to ask my father permission to leave the table if I wanted to go back and do some homework or whatever it was. And that respect for elders was something we learned from a very young age. And it's such an important lesson which parents could definitely learn in this day and age. I've talked about, and everyone knows about his connection with the Jamaat. And I mentioned how loyal he was to all Jamaat members. And when any Jamaat members would come and approach him for any kind of help, he would be instantly available for them. And I was always amazed that there were people who'd come to the house who would meet my father. He wouldn't know who they were, but because they were Andis, if they needed a letter of reference or they needed an introduction, he would instantly do so without question. He would do whatever he could to help them develop, benefit, and gain from his influence and his ability to open doors for them. As I said, he may not know them, but it didn't matter. He would take out his notepad and his pen and write them a letter of reference there and then, which they could then take on to wherever it was needed to hopefully try and find a job or get a job or get an academic place in a university or something. And his great passion was to spend time with members of the Jamaat whenever he could. But of course, time was very limited for him. And just one story that I remember, which I was told when he was in Benin, and he was a government guest visiting Benin, talking about science and technology. And he was there on a Friday, and the time for Jummah came. And he asked the president to be excused, and was asked if he could go and join the Jamaat for their Jummah. And one of the Jamaat members told me the wonderful story that we lived quite in a very remote area, and we never saw traffic coming down the dirt road. And suddenly we looked up as we were going for the Jummah namaz, and we saw this dust storm, and we saw this convoy of police vehicles with their flashing blue lights, and a number of cars driving at speed towards where we were. And we didn't know what was going on. And then suddenly the convoy came right up to the mission house, and out got your father. And he had asked the president to arrange for him to have a break from all the negotiations and meetings he was having, so he could travel 2 hours just to come and join the community for Jummah, because he wanted to meet the members and see how he could help them, how he could inspire them, and how he could spend time with them. Now, Wakasa, I've got a couple of things I could read. One was something that I thought was slightly different, I've not done before, and that's read one of his speeches called Islam and Science, Confrontation or Accord. There's also the piece that I could read from Khalifa Rabi, Ramallah, about his tribute to my father. Or would you like to take some questions? I'll be guided by you.
I'm sure that our viewers will be very keen to hear those quotes and those statements, and then we can go to questions
so
after that.
Let me read you through it. It's not a long speech, but it's something which I think, because there's been no footage of my father speaking, I thought I'd give you a chance to at least hear some of the content of how he used to write his speeches and what he would say. The Quran and Science. Let me say at the outset that I am both a believer as well as a practicing Muslim. I am a Muslim because I believe in the spiritual message of the Holy Quran. As a scientist, the Quran speaks to me in that it emphasizes reflection on the laws of nature, with examples drawn from cosmology, physics, biology, and medicine as signs for all men. Thus, can they not look up at the clouds? How are they created? And to the heaven, how it is upraised? And to the mountains, how are they rooted? And to the earth, how is it outspread? 88:17. And again, verily in the creation of the heavens and of the earth, and in the alternation of the night and of the day, are there signs for men of understanding? Chapter 3, verses 189 to 190. 750 verses of the Holy Quran, almost 1/8 of the book, exhort believers to study nature and to reflect and to make the best use of reason in their search for the ultimate, and to make acquiring of knowledge and scientific comprehension part of the community's life. The Holy Prophet of Islam emphasized that a lifelong quest for knowledge and sciences is obligatory upon every Muslim man and woman. This is the first premise on scientific knowledge with which any fundamentalist thinking in Islam must begin. Add to this the second premise, that there is not a single verse in the Holy Quran where natural phenomena are described and which contradicts what we know for certain from our own discoveries in sciences. Add to this the third premise. In the whole of Islamic history, there has never been an incident like that of Galileo. Persecution there has been, denunciation, even excommunication over doctrinal differences, but never the scientific beliefs. And paradoxically, the first Inquisition in Islam came to be instituted not by the orthodox theologians, but by so-called rationalists, the theologians themselves, who prided themselves on the use of reason. The saintly Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who was one of those subjected to the lash of their fury. But how seriously did the early Muslims take these injunctions of the Holy Quran and of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him? Barely 100 years after the Prophet's death, the Muslims had made it their task to master the then-known sciences. Founding international institutes of advanced studies, Beit al-Hikmas, they acquired an ascendancy in the sciences that lasted for the next 600 years. An aspect of reverence for the science in Islam was the patronage the sciences enjoyed in the Islamic Commonwealth. And to paraphrase what H.A.R. Gibb has written, to a greater extent than elsewhere, the flowering of the sciences in Islam was conditional on the liberality and patronage of those in high positions. So long as in one capital or another, princes and ministers found pleasure, profit, or reputation in patronizing the sciences, the torch was kept burning. The golden age of science was doubtless the age around the year 1000 CE, the age of Ibn Sina, Avicenna, the last of the medievalists and of his contemporaries, the first of the moderns, Ibn al-Haytham and al-Biruni. Ibn al-Haytham, al-Hazm, 965 to 1039, was one of the greatest physicists of all time. He made experimental contributions of the highest order in optics. He enunciated that a ray of light in passing through a medium takes the path which is easier and quicker. And in this he was anticipating Fermat's principle of least time by many centuries. He enunciated the law of inertia, later to become Newton's first law of motion. And part 5 of Roger Bacon's Opus Majus is practically a copy of Ibn al-Haytham's Optics. Al-Biruni, 973 to 1048, Ibn Sina's second illustrious contemporary, worked in Afghanistan. He was an empirical scientist like Ibn al-Haytham, as a modern and as unmedieval in outlook as Galileo, who came 6 centuries later. It is commonly alleged that Islamic science was a derived science, that Muslim science built on a theoretical basis laid down by the Greeks and made no changes to it. This statement is false. Listen, for example, to this assessment of Aristotle by al-Biruni. The trouble with most people is that their extravagance in respect of Aristotle's opinions, they believe that there is no possibility of mistakes in his views, though they know that he was only theorizing to the best of his capacity and never claimed to be immune from mistakes. Or this on geology with its insistence on observation. But if you see the soil of India with your own eyes and meditate on its nature, if you consider the rounded stones found in the earth, however deeply you dig, firstly stones that are huge near the mountains and where the rivers have a violent current, secondly the stones of a smaller size at a greater distance from the mountains, and where the streams flow more slowly, thirdly stones that appear pulverized in the shape of sand, where the streams begin to stagnate near their mouths and near the sea. And if you consider all this, you can scarcely help thinking that India was once a sea, which by degrees had been filled up by the alluvium of streams. According to Briffault, the Greeks systemized, generalized, and theorized, but the patient ways of detailed and prolonged observation and experimental inquiry were altogether alien to the Greek temperament. What we call sciences arose as a result of new methods of experiment, observation, and measurement, which were introduced into Europe by the Arabs. Modern science is the most momentous contribution of Islamic civilization. There's a few more pages. Again, I can finish it, or we can go into some questions.
We have about just over 10 minutes remaining. So I know that our viewers are very keen to ask these questions. So with your permission, we will share.
Absolutely.
Jazakumullah, Ahmad Sahib. So again, in the interest of time, I will pair some of these up. Again, apologies if we can't fit your question in. So the first question is from Tanveer Khokar Sahib, who asks, why was Italy chosen as the site for the institute that your father set up? Was that because of the refusal from Pakistan, or was there another reason to it?
It was the refusal of Pakistan, and the report that was given to the president was literally, and I quote, Salam wants to set up a hostel, a 5-star hostel for students. And that was a rejection from Pakistan. So when the idea was presented to the United Nations, the Italians said, we will give you half the budget and we will give you the building. and that's why it was in Italy.
Jazakallah. There are quite a few questions in relation to your family background and also about the domestic life that you had with your father, and you've mentioned quite a few anecdotes and some really inspiring examples. Are there any more that you can share in relation to your own upbringing and the inspiration that your father had on you and also your wider family?
There are a great many. I would urge members, if they haven't seen the film, to see the film, the documentary available on Netflix, because I do talk about some of these issues, my memories of my father's life, the lessons I learned from my father's life within that film. So in the interest of time, I'd point you to the documentary, and then if there's any other further questions, people can always reach out to me. I'm always available to talk about my father at any time.
Another question in relation to his own feelings and emotions about Pakistan as a country. So despite the treatment that he experienced at the hands of the authorities, what were your father's feelings towards Pakistan as a country?
I always make this very important point. My father had nothing but the huge love and admiration for Pakistan and its people. The fact that there were a few short-sighted politicians who chose to make his life miserable was a very small minority. The vast majority of people had a huge amount of affection, respect, and regard for my father. And one other point I just want to make here, which I think is important to make. I've traveled around the world and traveled extensively in a lot of Muslim countries. The only countries that had problems with my father in the Muslim world were Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the Arab Emirates. Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, Indonesia, India, Malaysia, all the Middle East African countries, from Jordan, Libya, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, none of them had any problems with Ahmadiyya or his beliefs, or tried to cause him any problems. It was just Pakistan and just Saudi Arabia in particular who had an issue. And even that, when he won the prize, one of the first telegrams he got was from the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia congratulating him. But of course, the Saudis would never invite him back to Pakistan, and he was never able to visit. But the Kuwaitis, the Bahrainis, the Omanis, all invited him to their countries, and all met him at the highest level and had no problems with him. So my point is, let's not lump all the Pakistan together. The issues were with a few mullahs and a few politicians.
Jazakumullah. Quite a few questions asking about if there's any English publication of your father's biography coming anytime soon. I think there's lots of material in Urdu.
There's a book available on Amazon by a chap called Gordon Fraser, and it's called Cosmic Anger. And there's also a book in Urdu which was written by his brother, which we, with the wonderful support of one of our Jamaat members, he's translated into English. And we're actually just going through the proofreading of that. And I hope, inshallah, that'll get printed very soon. And that's written by his younger brother. So it's written from a very family perspective. And it's a wonderful tribute to my father. So that'll be out in English soon, inshallah.
Jazakumullah. Another question from Malik Faraz Ahmad, who asks, to what extent would you say that Professor Salam Sahib's knowledge and love for the Quran influenced the way that he studied academically and also his subsequent scientific achievements?
The way he studied academically, actually the discipline of that came from his father, and the application of hard work came from his father. And of course, my grandfather was greatly influenced by the Holy Quran and the history of Islam and the need for hard work and the need to find knowledge. So that ability to apply himself and not to be afraid to apply himself. I remember, again, a story in government college where my father would ask the servant who looked after a number of rooms to lock his room from the outside and only open it to pass food in and then lock it again. So my father would not have the ability to open the door and go out and waste time, or have anybody come in and disturb him when he was working. So again, that's a focus of how much he respected time so he could work well. And I've spoken on many occasions again about the influence of the Holy Quran. My father himself has spoken about this. And as you saw in the clip at the beginning, that record player, the Quran was always playing in the background, whether he was in Italy, whether he was in the villa in Italy, or whether he was in his office, or whether he was at home here, the Holy Quran was always playing in the background.
Jazakallah. Ahmad Sahib, we have about 5 minutes remaining, and I know that our audience has been very captivated and spellbound by everything that you've shared with us, mashallah, this evening. Are there any other final experiences?
Let me then try and fit in the 5 minutes, the just 2.5 pages from Khalifa Rabi, which I always love reading because it brings tears to my eyes, because I witnessed the relationship between these two great men. But when I took my father for the mulaqats, he would always do with Khalifa Rabi. So I'll just read this very quickly. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the ever merciful. I take this opportunity to express my gratitude to the administrators of the International Center for Theoretical Physics, and to the conveners of this conference, and to all delegates who took time to come to pay tribute to the cherished memory of the late Professor Abdus Salam. I express my gratitude again to the organizing body for providing me with a singular satisfaction of being associated with this auspicious occasion in the honor of a unique man of genius. And this is Khalifa Rabi writing this himself. I knew him from my childhood, but only in a way that a child would know of stars. There was nothing intimate, impersonal in our relationship, which began in earnest as late as 1978, during my holiday visit to North America and Europe. When he learned of my arrival in London with my wife and 2 elder daughters, he insisted I find time to visit his home. Perhaps he also had in mind the intimacy and love with which my late mother always treated his wife when she was a young student in Qadian prior to the partition of India and Pakistan. His wife, Uncle Hafiz Begum, was even more keen for me and my family to spend a few leisurely hours at home with their family. And while the ladies were busy chatting together in another room, Dr. Salam and I were closeted together in his personal room. And it was then for the first time that we developed a deep, personal, intellectual, spiritual, and cordial relationship, which was to last until his death. His death left me mourning the departure of the most charming person whose interest was not confined to any single field of human inquiry. During that meeting, I discovered him in the broadest perspective in which he deserved to be discovered. He knew religion, he understood the philosophy of cryptic Sufism, his knowledge of history was wide and profound, and theoretical physics was his subject, and that was not the only subject of which he had a masterly command. His profound knowledge of chemistry, biology, and the universe of subparticles was amazing. His intimacy with cosmology was no less surprising. And when it came to the vastness of nature and its oneness with the attributes of God, it was there he outshone all other fields of his intellectual pursuits. His theory of the unified field sprung from his total dedication to the unity of God. He had firm belief that everything began with Allah will end up with Allah. This might have motivated him to scientifically prove the hypothesis of the unification of the fundamental forces of nature. And during our discussions, he revealed to me he had already advanced his research to demonstrate the unity of 2 other fundamental forces. And had his life permitted, I'm sure he would have received another Nobel Prize for his advanced work in this field. This short tribute to the memory of this genius is not meant to dwell upon his scientific achievements. I want to share with this august assembly today a few glimpses of Dr. Abdus Salam, a man who did not hesitate to discuss immense complexities of his scientific knowledge with an uninitiated person like I. He took pains to make me understand why the speed of light could not exceed 186,000 miles per second. I continued, however, to argue that under certain hypothetical conditions, the speed of light could be enhanced beyond this limitation. His tolerance with me during the course of the discussion, while I was a mere novice on the subject of theoretical physics, was a great tribute to his patience and grand-heartedness. At the end, however, he cautiously conceded, that if, as I suggested, the properties of the medium which facilitates maximum speed of light could be visualized to be different, the speed of light would correspondingly change, even transcending the present limitation. It was not his personal conviction, of course. His acceptance was conditional only to the big if involved. He accepted my suggestion, realizing perhaps that the real implication of my suggestion was related to the limitless attributes of God. Among many questions I raised to quench my thirst for knowledge was one regarding the incomprehensible nature of heat radiation. It could travel at the speed of light as though riding its wings, yet it could also move so slowly that it takes ages to reach the other end of a large room. If a fire is lit in a corner of a big hall, people sitting in one corner will hardly feel any heat emitted by the fire. This and many other intriguing questions were raised by me and answered by him, always in full earnest. To the question of heat radiation, he answered, as though in a confidential tone, the one thing that even scientists fail to understand is the true nature of heat. And it was during this fascinating, informal talk that I came to learn of the vastness of Abdus Salam. It was in that unique vastness that his genius lay. Ever since that meeting, we were not really separated again. He continued to seek my interview to help him resolve various problems, which confronted him from time to time, and I never failed to make the best use of such meetings to enhance my personal knowledge. His philanthropist attitude was boundless. It was truly universal, without the least parochialism. No religious, political, ethnic, or nationalistic boundaries were charted on his purely human heart. The International Centre for Theoretical Physics in Trieste has always paid, and will always pay, a standing ovation to the humanist in Abdus Salam. May Allah bless his soul in the hereafter, and may he also bless the noble objectives he pursued in the vastness of the material world he has left behind.
Jazakallah Ahmad Sahib for those very precious words and also giving us your precious time this evening. I think it's been an absolute pleasure for all of us. It's been a huge honor for us also as a Talim department to host what's been an extraordinary session tonight. Jazakallah. I think it's very clear from the comments that we received from our viewers the great love and affection there is for Professor Abdus Salam, certainly, but also for your family also, and the many memories and experiences that our members are also sharing about his life and how he touched their lives and made such a huge difference. A story of obviously tragedy in terms of the lack of recognition in Pakistan, but also of great triumph in terms of his successes in science, but also his great services to Islam and the Holy Quran. And we obviously pray that Allah keeps raising his status in heaven and forever remains an inspiration for us within the Jamaat, but also the world as a whole. Jazakumullah jaza. Our lectures return next Monday when we will have an Urdu lecture on Monday, the 14th of December. And that is a lecture entitled The Holy Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's Blessed Conduct During Warfare. And that lecture will be delivered by Hafiz Muhammad Zafrullah Abdus Sahib, and that will be in Urdu. So please join us for that lecture at 8 o'clock next Monday evening. If I could please hand over to our respected National Secretary Talim, Nadeem Rahman Sahib, for any final comments.
Jazakallah Waqar Sahib. As per usual, Ahmad Sahib, always inspiring to listen to you and hear about your father, and truly inspiring for all of us to hear what he went through. It just leaves me to obviously thank the viewers and yourself, and if I could humbly request you to lead us in silent prayer so we can end the program.
Exactly. Please join me in dua. Ameen.
Ameen. Jazakallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Jazakallah.